The summer they auctioned off the Voss land, it was raining so hard that the auctioneer had to shout over the drumming on the courthouse roof, and most of the county sat that one out entirely. 43 registered bidders had driven out from Millhaven that morning, taken one long look at the posted survey map with its 43% slope notation and its dense scrawl of Wild-Grape canopy, and driven home again before the gavel even lifted. 2 stayed. One was a land speculator from Springfield named Alderman Crouch, who sat in the back row in a good coat and put in exactly one bid of $180. Enough, he judged, to acquire the thing if no one else wanted it, and he was fairly certain no one would. The other was a young woman named Elsa Vane, who was 22 years old, who had exactly $212 to her name, and who raised her hand at $185, with a stillness so complete that the auctioneer almost missed it. Crouch looked at her over his shoulder the way a man looks at a child who has wandered into a conversation. He did not raise again. And so, for a delinquent tax bill of $185, Elsa Vane became the owner of 55 acres of vine-choked, boulder-seamed hill ground that every working farmer in Gallatin County agreed was good for exactly nothing. 3 years earlier, the thought would have undone her. Now it was simply the arithmetic she had been waiting to solve. What they did not know, what no one in Millhaven knew yet, was what those 55 acres were hiding, and what Elsa Vane's 22 hogs were going to find. One autumn earlier than all of that, Elsa had arrived in Millhaven with nothing resembling a plan and everything resembling determination. Her father's small claim in Ohio had gone to his creditors when she was 21, the week after the last frost, and she had walked away from it with the hogs, 12 of them then, a mixed Berkshire and scrub lot, a wagon, and the particular stubborn vision that had been forming in her since she was 15 years old and first noticed how hogs forage. Not what they ate. How. The root of it, the logic of it, the way a sow would walk an acre in a pattern that looked like accident and was not, the way a drove of hogs on good open ground would, over the course of a season, turn and aerate and fertilize that ground more thoroughly than any plow Elsa had ever worked behind. She had mentioned this observation once to her father, who was a kind man and not a cruel one. He had said gently that a person who puts their faith in hogs will end up with the same things a hog has. She had not mentioned it again, but she had kept watching. She rented a corner lot on the edge of Millhaven that first winter from an elderly German-Slovak man named Gregor Haas, who asked her $10 for the season and seemed to genuinely forget whether she had paid it. He was 71 years old, broad as a door, and had been farming a 20-acre mixed plot half a mile outside town for 40 years. When Elsa introduced herself and explained what she intended, a small drover's operation, hogs on rotation, gradual improvement of exhausted ground, Haas had looked at her for a long, considering time, and then said, in his accented, patient way, that the land does not care about your intentions. The land cares about what you do. Then he asked if she wanted coffee, and gave her a piece of information about Gallatin County soil drainage that she used every day for the next 4 years. The winter was cold, and the corner lot was exposed, and 2 of her 12 hogs died of it. She had 10 by spring, and she was 21 years old, and the corner of Millhaven that abutted her rental was a block of dry goods storefronts whose proprietors found various reasons to walk past her fence and make various observations. A man named Dunfrey, who kept the feed supply, told her kindly that she had done well to get out here before she lost another winter trying. A woman named Betcher, who was the wife of the second largest farmer in the county, said, to someone else, but near enough to Elsa to be audible, that it was a shame to see a young woman on her own reduced to living with hogs, as if one chose between the two. Elsa, hearing this, kept her eyes on the fence she was mending and said nothing. Being right is its own kind of reply, and the time for it had not come yet. She earned through that first spring by selling dressed hogs at the butcher's rate, which was low, and by hiring herself out for day labor on the Betcher farm and two others, which was honest work that paid honestly and left her evenings free. In the evenings she read whatever she could find about free-range swine management and soil regeneration. Haas lent her two German-language pamphlets that she translated slowly with a dictionary and a candle. She counted her money every Sunday night by the same candle. By June she had replaced her 2 losses and had 12 hogs again, and she had noticed something that she told no one about for months, keeping it banked inside her like a coal under ash. The corner lot, which had been a packed, exhausted strip of ground that grew nothing, was already changing where the hogs had been working it. The soil near the east fence, where she rotated them heaviest, had darkened and loosened. Clover came up in it that she had not planted. Haas walked by one afternoon and stopped at the fence and looked at the clover for a while. He said without surprise that a good hog is worth 3 plows. Elsa said she was beginning to think so. Haas said she had been thinking so since she got here. He had merely been waiting for her to have evidence. Then he went home. It was not a warm or theatrical moment. It was better than that. It was the first outside voice confirming what she had reasoned out alone, and it steadied her for everything that came next. What came next was the auction, and the 55 acres, and the beginning of the thing that would make Millhaven stop laughing and start watching. The Voss land sat on the north slope of Cutter Ridge, 3 miles from the edge of town, and it had been wild for 11 years. The Voss family had cleared the lower third of it in the 1870s, grazed it hard, and then abandoned the effort. After 2 successive dry seasons, stripped the topsoil, and the patriarch died. What reclaimed the cleared lower ground with startling speed was Wild-Grape, Vitis riparia, the frost grape, whose vines ran 40 feet and whose roots drove down into slope ground like they were looking for something. The upper section was rockier, more heavily canopied with second-growth oak and hickory, and there was a dry creek bed that Haas, when Elsa described it to him, said was probably not as dry as it appeared. He had farmed this county 40 years, he said, and a creek that disappears above a limestone shelf does not stop existing. It only stops being visible. He had a careful look in his eye when he said this. Elsa wrote it down. The stone silo was not on the survey map. The survey map was 11 years old, and the silo, she would learn, was older than that, built by the Voss family's predecessor, a family named Kern, sometime in the 1850s, from the same Ozark fieldstone that edged out of the ground all over the upper acreage. It was 22 feet in diameter, the walls a full 3 feet thick, and it was buried to the eaves in Wild-Grape so thorough and heavy that from the road or from any direction approaching across the lower field, it looked like a hill, a naturally rounded grape-covered hill. Elsa found it on her 3rd day of walking the property, when her lead sow, a large black Berkshire she had named Augusta, to the great amusement of everyone who heard this, pushed through a curtain of vine and failed to come out the other side for an unusually long time. Elsa followed the vine curtain to a wooden door, rotten at the hinges, and pushed it open, and stood in the cool, dark interior, smelling the particular clean mineral smell of old-dressed stone that has been sealed against weather for a decade. And she stayed very still for a moment, because she understood almost immediately what she was looking at. A silo with walls 3 feet thick, on a north-facing limestone shelf, with a grape canopy overhead that blocked direct summer sun. It was, without any modification at all, a cold storage structure that would hold temperatures through July, that a purpose-built ice house in Millhaven would have envied. She did not tell anyone about the silo for 6 weeks. She told Augusta, who was indifferent, and who had already claimed the cool stone floor as a preferred resting spot, and had to be persuaded out again by the promise of something better, a negotiation Elsa understood required patience. The work of the next 16 months was the most demanding of Elsa's life, and also the most precise, and she kept a small ledger of it with a carpenter's pencil, whose worn-down stub she replaced twice. She ran the hogs on a managed rotation across the lower 40 acres, moving them every 10 days in a pattern she had worked out on paper over the winter, based on the clover's re-establishment rate and the slope's drainage angle. The Wild-Grape was not an obstacle. The Wild-Grape was the point. Her hogs, given access to the vine-covered lower ground, rooted and foraged with a focused intensity that Elsa could only describe as purposeful. They did not clear the ground brutally, the way a plow clears it, leaving it naked and vulnerable to the first hard rain. They cleared it selectively, rooting up the vine bases, churning the matted duff layer, leaving behind a worked earth that was dark and loose, and already showing, within a season, the faint beginning of a grass understory. The Wild-Grape they piled at the margins, or rather the hogs did, following the logic of their own foraging economics. By August of the first full season, Elsa had 7 cleared acres on the lower slope that she put into winter rye, and a herd that had grown, through careful breeding with a Berkshire boar she borrowed from Hogs for 2 weeks, and returned with interest in the form of a dressed ham to 22 animals. August arrived on the lower Cutter Ridge slope like the open door of a furnace. The creek bed that Hogs had predicted was not entirely dry turned out to be correct by the second week of the month, when a seep appeared in the limestone floor of the dry bed about 60 yards above where the surface channel ended. And by the third week it was a thin but reliable trickle that Elsa redirected with a clay and stone berm she built herself over 4 days, working from first light until she could not see her hands. The water ran into a shallow holding area near the silo, which she lined with tamped clay and fieldstone, and the hogs, who had been ranging up to the creek bed of their own accord since the seep appeared, came to the holding pond and stayed near it, and the ground around it, already worked by the hogs ranging, began to do what Elsa had believed it would do. It greened, not dramatically, not in a way anyone driving the road 3 miles away would have noticed. But she noticed, and she wrote it down, and she added it to the arithmetic in the ledger that she reread by candlelight each Sunday. Hogs visited twice that summer, both times making the 3-mile walk on his own initiative, and both times making no particular comment about the state of the work except small practical observations, that the berm needed an overflow channel or the first hard rain would take it out, that the rye she had put in the lower 7 acres was a good choice for the first year, but she should consider legumes the year following to work the nitrogen back. She made notes of both observations and acted on them. The overflow channel saved the berm in September when a 3-day rain came down hard enough to double the seep flow. She thought of Hogs on the second day of that rain, standing in the door of the silo in the drum and pour of it, watching the overflow channel do its work, and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite love, and was in every practical respect more useful than either. There was a boy named Cal who was 12 years old and belonged loosely to the Tanner family, whose farm road intersected the Cutter Ridge Road half a mile below Elsa's gate. He had appeared at her fence in the second summer with the frank curiosity of a person who does not yet know they are supposed to have an opinion about someone before meeting them. He asked what the hogs' names were. Elsa told him that the big black sow was Augusta, and that the rest of them she called by number, and Cal informed her gravely that this was insufficient, and that she should let him fix it. She told him he was welcome to name anything that did not have one, provided he was going to be useful while he did it. He was. He had a gift for moving the hogs at rotation time that Elsa, for all her patience and observation, did not have. Something in his walk, some frequency of confidence in 12-year-old legs that the hogs read as correct and followed without the usual resistance. He came on Saturdays and then on Fridays too, and eventually on most days that did not have school in them, and by the end of the second summer he had named all 22 hogs, and Elsa knew all the names without having tried to learn them the way you know a thing you have heard enough times in a voice that believes in it. Augusta remained Augusta. She had seniority. The town's opinion of the enterprise on Cutter Ridge evolved in the way of most town opinions, slowly, in the wrong direction first, and then all at once when it could not avoid the evidence. Through the first winter and well into the second year, the view in Millhaven was unchanged and uncomplicated. That Elsa Vane had paid $185 for the privilege of working herself to exhaustion on 55 acres of stone and vine, that this was exactly the kind of thing a young woman alone would do when she was too proud to ask for cents, and that the hogs would either die or get loose, and that would be that. Dunfrey, at the feed supply, extended her a credit line so small it was more insult than assistance, and when she paid it off at the end of the first season in full, he seemed genuinely confused by this. Betcher's wife, when Elsa came into the dry goods store one October morning, still wearing the clay of the berm project on her boots, made a remark about the smell that the other women in the store laughed at, and Elsa bought her flour and salt and left, and did not allow her face to do anything about it until she was back in the wagon heading north on the Cutter Ridge Road. And then she let it do what it needed to do, and then it was done. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it, because believing it is rotten requires nothing of you, and admitting you were wrong requires everything. Millhaven was not a cruel town. It was a careful one. It had been wrong before, expensively, and it had learned the economy of postponing judgment, which, in practice, looked very much like dismissal. The thing that began to shift opinion was not a dramatic event. It was the ham. A purchasing agent for a hotel in Springfield named Horace Nell came through Millhaven in the late fall of the second year, looking for reliable meat supply for the hotel's restaurant, which had ambitions. He was a small man with the perpetual mild anxiety of someone responsible for other people's standards, and he had been directed to Dunfrey's, who directed him to the Betcher farm, who gave him a good price and a reasonable product, and told him there was no one else in the county worth speaking to. On his way back through town, Nell's horse threw a shoe at the corner by the feed supply, and while he waited for it to be reset, he fell into conversation with Haas, who was there buying seed, and who, when the hotel man mentioned he had been looking at pork, said simply that there was a place on Cutter Ridge he might consider, and described in 3 sentences what Elsa Vane had been doing to that ground for 2 years. Nell, whose professional instincts were good, asked if the product was available to taste. Haas said he imagined it could be arranged if Nell was willing to drive 3 miles on a rutted road. Nell was willing. He arrived unannounced in the early afternoon to find Elsa splitting wood in front of the silo, which by now had been cleared of its grape canopy, its round field stone walls washed clean by that September's rain, into something that in the low autumn light looked frankly beautiful, a thing made with extraordinary care a generation ago, standing exactly as it had been left, because stone and patience agree with each other. Nell looked at the silo and then at the hogs in the upper pasture, working the hickory mast that was coming down in the October wind, and then at the lower 7 acres of rye, dark green and close woven, and then at the young woman who had put all of this together, and he had the expression of a man who has been given incorrect information. He tasted the ham. He tasted the salt-cured bacon she had put up in the silo's cool interior, 4 sides of it hanging in the stone dark at a temperature that Millhaven's butcher would have required 20 pounds of ice per week to approximate. He tasted the lard, which was white and firm and had a clean sweetness to it that range-foraged Berkshire hogs produce when they are eating mast and root, and good rye-field gleaning and not being crowded. Nell ate standing up in the silo doorway, and he did not speak for a long time, and when he spoke, he asked what she was getting for a dressed hog at Dunfrey's credit rate, and she told him. And he named a price per pound for ongoing supply that was, by Elsa's arithmetic on the ride home from every butcher's delivery she had made in 2 years, somewhere between a fair price and a generous one, and she accepted it before he had finished the sentence. This was a mistake, she decided at 3 in the morning, and then decided it was not, and then decided she would renegotiate 1 cent per pound upward at the spring delivery, which she did, and Nell agreed without argument, which told her she had still been too modest. Word of the Springfield Hotel contract did not arrive in Mill Haven silently. Nell, who was a man of enthusiasms, mentioned it to Dunfrey when he came back through for horseshoe nails, and said something about the product on Cutter Ridge being unlike any range pork he had sourced in 3 counties, and Dunfrey absorbed this information the way Mill Haven absorbed all unwelcome corrections, with a pause and a polite word and a privately thorough reconsideration conducted where no one could see it. It was also approximately this time that Alderman Crouch reappeared. He came in March, which was mud season, on the Cutter Ridge Road, and therefore a tribute to the seriousness of his interest. He arrived in a good wagon with a young man who might have been a clerk, and he stood at Elsa's gate in the mud in his good boots and said, pleasantly, that he had heard she had done interesting things with the Voss property, and that he wondered if she had ever thought about selling. He named a price. It was $1,100. He said it as if it were a favor, in the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone who might not grasp it without help. He pointed out, still pleasantly, that the road to the ridge was difficult, that one person alone could not keep up this kind of operation indefinitely without capital and connections, that he himself had connections to a larger packing concern in Springfield that could guarantee her the kind of contract a solo operator could never secure on her own. Elsa listened to all of this. She had been up since 4 in the morning, and there was still mud on her hands from the morning's work, and she was, at the end of this speech, very quiet for a long moment. She said that she already had a Springfield contract. Crouch said he was aware of that, the Nell arrangement, and that it was a fine start, but that a serious packing concern could do considerably better, and that the property itself was worth more to a capitalized buyer than it ever could be to a single operator. Elsa said she would think about it. Crouch said he was glad to hear it, and that he hoped she would be sensible, and went back to his good wagon. The young clerk looked at the silo over his shoulder as the wagon turned, and his expression was not the expression of a man looking at a problem. Elsa saw it. She said nothing. She went back to her work. She did not think about it in the sense Crouch meant. She thought about it in the sense of a person who has been told they cannot hold what they built, filing the statement away in the part of her mind that runs beneath the daily count, and letting it harden there into something she could use. What she could not have anticipated was the summer. It was the driest summer in Gallatin County in 22 years, which was exactly Elsa's age, and which she found in her darker private moments cosmically unreasonable. The creek below Mill Haven went to a trickle by the 1st week of June, and to nothing by the 4th week. The wells on the low-ground farms began to show mud at the bottom in July. The Betcher farm, which had 200 acres in corn, watched the ears form short and pale, and then watched them stop forming at all. Dunfrey's stock of emergency feed went in 6 weeks. The county had not seen a failure this complete in a generation, and by August the particular atmosphere of a farm community facing collective ruin had settled over Mill Haven like smoke, quiet and gray, and tasting of fear. The spring on the Cutter Ridge limestone shelf, the one that Haas had predicted, that Elsa had found and banked and lined with fieldstone and clay, ran through the dry summer at a reduced but constant rate. The hickory and oak canopy on the upper acreage kept the soil temperature low enough that the moisture did not leave it the way it left the open low-ground fields. The rye, in its 3rd year now, and well established, held its root system through July, and came back thin but alive in August. The hogs, which numbered 34 by this point, were thinner than Elsa would have liked, but they were alive, and they had water, and they were foraging in shade. The lower farms had none of these things. Hunger changes a town. It does not change it slowly. By late July, Elsa had 3 families from the farms below the ridge come to her fence, not to mock, not to assess, not to make any observation about her smell or her hogs or her suitability to the enterprise, but to ask if she had anything to spare. The first was a family named Luth, who had 4 children and a corn crop that had produced 11 bushels from 40 acres, and would not carry them to January. The second was Dunfrey himself, who came alone, and who said very little, and whose face said a great deal. The third was the Betcher farm, and it was not Betcher who came but his wife, who stood at Elsa's gate and said nothing for a moment, and then said that she hoped Elsa would consider her in any arrangement about available goods, and the word consider was doing considerable work in that sentence, holding in it something that might have been an apology if it had been given more room. Elsa fed them. She sold dressed hogs at the same price she had been charging Nell, not less, which would have been charity and would have cost her the operation, but not more, which would have been the other thing, and she was not the other thing. She sold the cured bacon from the silo at the same rate she had sold it in good years. When the Luth family had nothing to pay with in August, she took a note in writing for half, and told them the other half was a neighbor's arrangement, and left it at that. The ledger she kept on these transactions she balanced every Sunday by the same candle, and the arithmetic was tight. And there were 2 weeks in August where it was very tight indeed, and she did not share this with anyone except, in the most general terms, with Haas, who had his own spring-fed ground and was managing, and who listened and said what he thought, and was right. It was during these same August weeks that the thing with Crouch resolved itself. He came back in late August, and this time he did not come with a clerk. He came with a man who carried papers, and the papers were, he explained with the same pleasant certainty, a formal offer of purchase with a 60-day acceptance window, and the price was now $900, not $1,100, because the drought had, he said, materially affected the land's value, which was an argument that required a listener who did not know that Cutter Ridge was the only reliable water source in 3 miles of otherwise dry country, and that the stone silo full of cured pork was the reason 11 families in Gallatin County were going to eat through the winter. Elsa looked at the papers. She looked at Crouch. She asked him how he had arrived at the figure of $900 when the property was producing more revenue in a drought year than it had in a wet one. Crouch said that markets were uncertain and that a single operator could not expect to maintain this kind of output, and that she should really consider her position carefully, and that he had investors who were very serious about this property. Elsa said she was glad to hear investors were interested, because she had been thinking about what the spring water rights alone were worth to the farms below the ridge, and that she was prepared to offer those farms a shared-use arrangement for a reasonable annual fee, and that, with those agreements in hand, she expected her banker in Springfield would find the property quite interesting as collateral. And then she said a number that was her banker's number, because she had ridden to Springfield and had that conversation 3 weeks earlier, the day after Crouch's first return visit, when she had understood what was coming. The man with the papers wrote nothing down. Crouch's pleasant expression did not entirely leave his face, but it relocated somehow to just his mouth, and his eyes were doing something else. He asked how she had known about the investors. She had not known about the investors. She had stated a negotiating position. His reaction had confirmed the rest. She said she thought they were done, and she went back to splitting wood, and after a moment she heard the wagon leaving, and she split 4 more pieces before she let herself feel anything, and what she felt was something too steady and bone-deep to be called triumph, though that was the closest word for it. She had been right, and she had held, and she was not going anywhere. By the time October came and the drought broke in a 3-day rain that ran the creek below Mill Haven full again in 18 hours, the accounting of who had survived the summer and who had not was plain enough for anyone in Gallatin County to read. The Betcher corn, like most of the low-ground corn, was a loss. 3 families on the East Road had sold parcels. Dunfrey had taken a banknote. Cutter Ridge had lost no animals and no inventory, and had fed from its store portions of 11 households through the worst 6 weeks. Cal, who was 13 now, came on the first clear day after the rain and found Elsa in the lower field assessing the rye, and he said, with the directness of a boy who does not yet know the difference between reporting and consoling, that his father said she was the only one in the county who had her head on straight, and that everyone was saying so. Elsa said she was glad the rain had come. Cal said it wasn't about the rain, was it? Elsa looked at the lower field, at the dark, worked, root-held soil that had been grape-choked slope 3 years ago, at the rye coming back in it, at the 34 hogs moving in the upper canopy in the clean October light, at the round stone silo with its field stone walls holding the cool dark that had kept everything safe through the worst summer in a generation, and she said, no, it was not about the rain, it was about what you put in the ground before the rain stopped coming. She had said it without thinking, and then she heard it and recognized it as the version of the thing Haas had been saying to her for 3 years in one form or another, and she thought she would go tell him that, the next time she saw him, and she did, that same week. And Haas listened and was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet when something had confirmed a thing he already believed. And he said that the land does not care about your intentions, only your work, and that she had done the work. He said it as though it had always been true, which it had. He said it as though she had always known it, which she had. She had just needed the 3 years and the summer and the stone silo and the 34 hogs and the arithmetic of 11 families fed to understand it all the way down. The Springfield Hotel expanded its contract in the spring. Nell, who was a man of enthusiasms, had used the winter to tell anyone in his professional circle who would listen about the Cutter Ridge operation, about the range-foraged Berkshire pork and the stone-cold curing silo, and the woman who had turned 55 acres of tax-delinquent vine country into the most reliable food source in Gallatin County in a drought year. By February, he had 2 additional restaurant inquiries that he forwarded to Elsa, along with a note written in his small, careful hand saying that he had been right about her the day he had tasted the ham in the silo doorway, and that he hoped she had been raising her prices. She had. Not by much. Enough. The water agreement she offered the low-ground farms was, as she had described it to Crouch, reasonable, a flat annual fee that gave each signatory family access to the Ridge Spring through any future dry season, managed through a shared maintenance schedule that Elsa drew up herself and that distributed the labor fairly according to acreage. 8 farms signed in the first month. The Betcher farm signed last, which surprised no one, and Betcher himself came up the Cutter Ridge Road in person to sign it and stood looking at the silo and the hogs and the field for a moment before he came through the gate, the way a man looks at something he needs to revise his understanding of. And then he came in and signed, and Elsa gave him coffee, and they talked about the legume rotation she was running in the lower field, which was in its 2nd year and performing as Haas had predicted it would, building the nitrogen back into soil that had been stripped twice in 50 years, and was now, slowly, becoming something different, something capable and generous, a ground that remembered what had been done to it, and responded to care the way all exhausted things do, given patience and time and someone willing to do the work without an audience. Dunfrey extended her an actual credit line in April. She did not need it, but she took it, because the day would come when she would expand, and she intended to be ready. She thanked him plainly. He said she had done a remarkable thing. She said she had done a plain thing, which was to look at what was there and believe what she saw. He thought about that for a while. She suspected he was not entirely sure what it meant. She was not sure she was, either, entirely, only that it was true, and that it was the whole of it, the complete answer to the question of how a young woman with $212 and 10 hogs and no backing had turned 55 acres of vine and stone into a water-secure, drought-proof, hotel-contracted operation that had fed a corner of Gallatin County through the worst summer in a generation. She had looked at what was there. She had believed what she saw. She had done the work that her seeing required day after day after day, in the dark and in the mud and in the furnace of that August, through the mockery and the doubt and the pressure, and the 2 weeks in August when the ledger was as thin as she ever wanted it to be, and she had not left, and she had not sold, and she had not stopped counting. The silo stood on the north face of Cutter Ridge for 30 more years, and every summer that turned dry in Gallatin County was a summer the neighbors on the low ground were glad for the water agreement and for what Elsa had built there. Cal Tanner worked the property through his teens and into his 20s, and eventually managed the eastern acreage under his own lease, and the naming tradition he had started with Augusta ran down through every generation of hogs that followed her, 22 names per year, all of them recorded in a ledger alongside the arithmetic. Augusta herself lived to an age that Elsa considered either a testament to range foraging or to stubbornness, and she was not certain which, and suspected they were the same thing. Gregor Haas walked up the Cutter Ridge Road for the last time, when he was 75, the autumn of the 4th year, and stood at the fence looking at the lower field for a long time, and Elsa stood with him and did not talk, because there was no need, and the field did what it did, which was to be green and held and alive in soil that had been pronounced worthless by 43 bidders in the rain outside the Millhaven courthouse, and it was, by every reckoning that mattered, neither of those things. The land does not care about your intentions, Haas had said, that first winter in the rented corner lot with her 10 hogs and her carpenter's pencil, and her faith in what she had seen with her own eyes. Only your work. She had done the work. And here was the land, telling anyone willing to look exactly what it thought of that.